Lord in heaven, we thank you for the blessed hours of the Sabbath, and we thank you for the opportunity to gather to discuss things that pertain to our character development, our eternal salvation, our witness for you, Lord, in this time, the message that we're soon to bear to your church and soon to bear to the world. May you please bless every household represented here. May you guide us in this next period as we enter the main study. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Happy Sabbath again. I'm sorry, I'm just going to ask if you can hear me because I unplugged, I changed my output. I just want to make sure or rather, I want to make sure that I can hear you. If someone would like to open their mic and send their greetings.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So Henry, I couldn't hear you. I'm going to. Would you mind trying again?
Sure. I was just going to say, yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, I can hear you now. I couldn't hear you before. All right. That being said, today we're...
Sorry, yes? Can I just also mention that I think everybody's quite comfortable that you could just have a full session there, however long it would take.
Okay. Right. So we're having a repetition and an enlargement this morning and afternoon because it turns out what I wanted to do was a recap of Elder Tess's study on feminism. When you're talking about feminism and the test of sexism. So for a bit of context, I'll just share my screen real quick. Okay, so for a bit of context, you look at what the top line is the Omega history of modern Israel, and the bottom line is the line of the 144,000. The final dispensation in the line of the 144,000 is the period that came to a close at the end of last year, 2019 to 2021. And these waymarks, 2019 and 2021, they're not primary waymarks in the line of the 144,000, but the message that is put in place over the course of these two waymarks, the message that is put in place over here, this is the formalization of the message that is going to go out at the Sunday law, right? It's the formalization of the message that will be empowered with a loud cry when the Sunday law waymark is reached. So, and the formalized message over these two waymarks, the formalized message is dealing with the subject of gender. Right, just dealing with the subject of gender and sexism. So we understand that gender is the test now. It's the test not only for the priests, as when you speak of the history of the priests, it began to be opened up it began with the midnight cry, right? But this message on gender that is being that has undergone its formalization is the test for us now, and it's the test that's going to go to Adventism. It's the test that's going to go to the world. So when we speak about gender, when we talk about gender, feminism is the medium through which gender is considered. It's one of the, I guess, the primary it's a primary medium through which the subject of gender is conceptualized, is articulated, and is advocated for. So we want to understand the history of feminism. And so that's where we're going to spend a bit of time. We want to talk about the history of feminism. And after having conducted an overview of the history of feminism, we want to understand the schools of feminist thought that have developed. And we want to understand the issues that are involved in these schools of feminist thought, as well as the right perspective that we in this movement should have on the subject of feminism, right? Okay, I was about to make a point, but I'll leave that for later on in the study, right? We want to understand the right perspective on feminism, the perspective that we should have. So what is feminism? What is feminism by definition? Feminism it refers to a range of socio-political rather, movements and ideologies that aim to define and establish the political, economic, personal, and social equality of the sexes. That's a fairly robust definition. And feminism incorporates the idea that we've been discussing through Sabbath school, that societies, by and large, prioritize the male point of view, and that women are treated unjustly within those societies. And so that's a useful textbook definition of feminism. But when you look at its history, the history of feminism is usually conceptualized within the framework of waves, distinct waves, waves which are distinct periods of activity that fulfill certain characteristics, distinct period of activity, feminist activity, right? So we're going to go through the waves of feminism, naturally starting with the first wave. But before we come to the first wave, it would be useful to make note of some developments that sort of pave the way for first wave feminism, right? And as we consider that, we can examine pre-19th century developments, right? If we look at the 19th century as the time period when feminism really took off, there are some pre-19th century developments that are significant as far as being antecedents of the work done within first wave feminism. So movements to broaden women's rights did begin much earlier than the 19th century. The 19th century will mark the beginning of the first wave. And if you read about it, you can find noteworthy efforts going as far back as the 15th century, but we're not going all the way there. There's a name I want to highlight for us, and that's Mary Wallstonecraft. Mary Wallstonecraft. I'll just write it down. And so you can write it as well. Mary Wallstonecraft. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft, she was a British woman. She published one of the first feminist treatises, a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And she wrote this in 1792. Okay. And in it, she advocated for the social and moral equality of the sexes. Now, the period in which she wrote, and the period which had direct influence upon her, was affected by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Enlightenment, right? Rousseau was a philosopher of the Enlightenment, and she was greatly influenced by his work. Now, Rousseau presented the idea of a democratic society. Remember, the Enlightenment was, sorry, I don't want to. That's a bit of a detour. I'll stay on course. In his works on the Enlightenment, Rousseau presented the idea of a democratic society, a society that was based on the equality of men, and that was it. That was the issue. It presented the concept of a society governed by people who were equals before the law, equals within the democratic system, but women were left out of the conversation. And she was intrigued by his work, but her purpose, what she advocated for, was the extension of that democratic society to include women as well, right? And these are the ideas that she presented in her writings. And where Mary Wollstonecraft becomes significant, I'll just stop sharing. Where Mary Wollstonecraft becomes significant is that her ideas and her writings helped shape the thinking of the suffragettes who campaigned for the women's right to vote in the 19th century United States of America. So you have her, and she wasn't the only one. There were others as well, but you have works like hers influencing there's a generation of women who would then play a pivotal role in launching the first wave of feminism, and all the successes in improving women's lot that came with that. So when you speak of the first wave feminism was a period of feminist activity and thought that occurred during the 19th and early 20th centuries throughout the Western world, right? And a characteristic of the first wave is that it focused on legal issues, primarily securing women's right to vote, right? This was the key victory of first wave feminism. So the movement began around 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention, right? There was a convention of women in Seneca Falls. Seneca Falls was the home of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. That's maybe for time, I'll just trust that my articulation was good enough rather than write it down. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she lived in Seneca Falls, and her, along with another woman by the name of Lucretia Mott, M-O-T-T, they conceived the idea of the convention and they directed it. Now, to where these two women crossed paths, you have to go 8 years before that, to the year 1840. Both these women were active abolitionists. They sought the abolition of slavery. Now, in 1840, there was the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, England, that they sought to attend, but no women were allowed, so they were barred. And it was there, outside the convention in London, that they met, and then they maintained a correspondence and developed a relationship. So then that brings you to New York State in 1848, to the Seneca Falls Convention, where they brought about 200 women, and they discussed their grievances and the social, civil, and religious rights of women. And in that convention, they passed 12 resolutions calling for equal rights, including the right to vote for women. 12 resolutions pertaining to the equal rights of women, which included the right to vote. So they began to advocate, mobilize, promote, demonstrate. They began their work to see towards these 12 resolutions and to see their to begin to work towards the realization of their goals and objectives. So when you look at first wave feminism, the point is made in the literature on it that it involved a wide range of women, some belonging to conservative Christian groups and others belonging to very progressive, or more radical groups who reflected much of the thinking and spirit of second wave feminism. It brought together a broad range of women and a broad range of women's groups. But the creation of the range of women's organizations that would be involved in first wave feminism was a direct result of the Second Great Awakening. You remember Alda Tess in her talking about the external history of the Alpha of modern Israel, has laid out the concept, and speaking of the history of Protestantism, she's spoken about the Great Awakenings. And when we talk about the Second Great Awakening, this was that religious movement in the early 19th century, which altered the religious climate in America in many different ways. But an important way was this spirit and attitude of individual agency that it instilled, right? Versus established clergy, going through official channels and relying on the clergy. It instilled this spirit of individual agency, that people had the agency to have direct communion with God without the intermediary of a hierarchical clergy. So the awakening had social impacts in terms of the thinking of society that went that extended beyond the religious world. And it's in the climate created by the Great Awakening that you have first wave feminism emerging, and really these women's organizations mushrooming and doing their work. So the end of the first wave, as we've said, is linked to the passage of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. This was in 1920. This was the measure granting women the right to vote. And this was the major victory of the movement, but it also included certain other reforms in higher education, in the workplace and professions, and in healthcare. But the main victory was that first Amendment, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. I could say more on first wave feminism. There are lots of things to consider, like how the feminist movement interacted with the abolitionist movement, the civil right, with the abolitionist movement, and the push to, the push to abolish slavery for one, the push to gain equal rights for people of color. It wasn't always a smooth relationship, right? But even though Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, even though they were abolitionists, they did not advocate for universal suffrage. They did not want Black men to be granted the right to vote before white women, right? So there were some frictions there, shall we say. But for our purposes, that's an overview of first wave feminism. Moving on to the second wave of feminism. So with second wave feminism, it is widely accepted that the movement lasted from the 1960s into the early 1980s. But the exact years of the movement are difficult to pinpoint and are often disputed. But in terms of its context, it is understood to have come about in part as a delayed reaction against the renewed domesticity of women after World War II, right? What was going on there? World War II, men are drafted, men are called to the front line, and a lot of the jobs that they had left vacant back home are filled by women, right? So there's this period when, as far as women's individual agency, women's independence, and so on and so forth, that wartime period, women experienced a bit of a I'll use the word a boom. These new opportunities were opened up to them by the fact that the men were away. Even with the war economy, a lot of the women were in the factories that were producing the weapons and equipment to continue the war. But the war ends, the soldiers come back, and these women that were in the workforce working for themselves, they are relegated back to their homes, right? Or pushed back to their homes. So there's this period of renewed domesticity after World War II that's accompanied by a post-war economic boom and the economic growth that came with that economic boom. And this, within the cultural media, this promotion of the concept of the ideal family, in these new suburbs that were mushrooming in the post-war era, right, was one where the woman stayed at home and women focused on their family-oriented duties. So this is the context. And during this time, women did not tend to seek employment due to their engagement with their domestic and household duties, which were seen as their primary duty. And you have Betty Frieden. Betty Frieden, if you watched all the Tez's presentations, she spoke on her at length. Betty Frieden began in 1963. She published a book called The Feminine Mystique. The Feminine Mystique by Betty Frieden. And the publication of this book in 1963 is really seen as the beginning of, is marked as a starting point for second wave feminism. In 1963, you have two important developments. You have the publication of The Feminine Mystique by Betty Frieden, and you have President John F. Kennedy releasing a report by the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. Right. So John F. Kennedy's report on the status of women, it criticized the inequalities facing women, and it called for a constitutional remedy to the problem. Right. So more can be said about that, but that's for your research. That was in 1963. In Alda Tessa's presentation, she focused on The Feminine Mystique, this book. And this book, discussing primarily white women, Frieden explicitly objected to how women were being depicted within the mainstream media, the cultural media, right? Which was then that the women's happiest place, the best lot for a woman was within a home, right? She explicitly objected to how women were being portrayed by the media and how placing them at home as housewives limited their possibilities and wasted their potential. She helped conduct an important survey using her old classmates from Smith College. She attended Smith College. And this survey revealed that the women who played a role at home and in the workforce, they were more satisfied with their life compared to women who simply stayed home. The women who stayed home showed feelings of agitation, sadness, depressive symptoms. And she concluded that many of these unhappy women immersed themselves in the idea that they should have no ambitions outside their home, right? That this was a cause of their unhappiness. And she described this as, quote unquote, the problem that has no name, right? So there was her book and the impact that that had on society, and this presidential report, this report of the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, right? Both in 1963, they produce a reaction, they create an influence which spurred a period of feminist activity referred to as the second wave, right? So when we look at the second wave of feminism, in contrast to the first wave, the second wave broadened the range of issues and the range of victories that they would win in the legal sphere. First wave, the right to vote. Second wave, you see a whole range of issues that they begin to seek equal rights legislation on, and that they begin to win on, right? So by 1963, you have Frieden publishing her book. By 1964, she was already referencing a movement she was seeing, right, in connection with the ideas that she was communicating. And in 1863, you have the Equal Pay Act of sorry, I said 1863, I meant 1963. You start to see these legal victories. You have the Equal Pay Act of 1963. I think the name tells you what it's about. You have Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And Title VII prohibited discrimination by the covered employees on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So that's Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Then you have a court case, Griswold versus Connecticut. Griswold versus the state of Connecticut in 1965, the Supreme Court ruling in 1965. And this was a landmark decision of the US Supreme Court, in which the court ruled that the Constitution of the United States protects the liberty of married couples to buy and use contraceptives without government restriction, right? Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965. Then you have a 1967 executive order extending full affirmative action rights to women. You have the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, which made it unlawful for any creditor to discriminate against any applicant in the granting of credit on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, marital status, or age, right? And we could actually go on and on, right? That's the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, 1974. And of course, falling within second wave feminism is Roe v. Wade, which has also been spoken about at length. That was in 1973. So second wave feminism was largely successful. The only failures that it really suffered was its failure to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, which only managed to garner 35 states, leaving it 3 states short of ratification. And to this day, the Equal Rights Amendment, there've been more recent pushes to try to push it to the fore again, but to this date, the Equal Rights Amendment has not been made part of the Constitution. And You have Richard Nixon, who vetoed the Comprehensive Child Development Bill of 1972. He vetoed the Comprehensive Child Development Bill of 1972. This would have provided a multi-billion-dollar national daycare system, right, for young children. So those were the major legislative defeats, but the movement is considered, by and large, to have been a success. So second wave feminism ended in the early 1980s with the Feminist Sex Wars, and it was succeeded by third wave feminism in the early 1990s. So we're going to discuss the end of second wave feminism and the sex wars, which lead to the third wave. But an important development within second wave feminism was the development of distinct schools of feminist thought. You see the movement begin to fragment into different camps, different schools of thought. And they're quite numerous, actually, but the three main ones that you see emerging out of the second wave, you have liberal or mainstream feminism, radical feminism, and cultural feminism. So we're going to discuss these three schools of thought that emerged out of the second wave. But before we do that, we'll talk a bit about the feminist sex wars, which are seen as marking the end of the second wave. Okay, I just thought I'd take a look at the comments to see if I was missing anything. So the feminist sex wars, in the interlude of the late 1970s and early 1980s, the feminist sex wars arose as a reaction against the radical feminism of the second wave, right? The radical feminism of the second wave had views on sexuality, right, including pornography, erotica, prostitution, lesbian sexual practices, the role of transgender women, and so on. And it had views on this that some feminists began to challenge, to push up against, with the concept of sex positivity, right? So you had radical feminists. You had radical feminists who opposed pornography, right? They're also called anti-porn feminists, and they argue that pornography is harmful to women, and that it constitutes a strong causality of violence against women. And they say that the production of pornography, that it entails physical, psychological, and economic coercion of women, of the women that perform and model in it. And they believe this to be true, even when the women involved present themselves as enjoying it or even choosing it. Right. So the radical feminists believe that pornography contributes to sexism, and that the women involved are objectified. They're reduced to mere receptacles, objects for the sexual pleasure of men, right? So they took a position that was opposed to pornography. Then you have those who rejected this idea, who are referred to as sex positive feminists, and they viewed, and many of them as being liberal feminists, they viewed pornography as a medium for women's sexual expression. And they view many of the radical feminist views on sexuality, including their views on pornography, as being as oppressive as those of patriarchal religions and ideologies, and that anti-porn radical feminists, that their ideas, their discourse, their positions ignore, trivialize women's agency, right? The ability of women to choose. right? So these debates raged on and really fractured the feminist movement around, like, as I said, not just pornography. I highlighted pornography, but the range of issues that I mentioned at the beginning. And what do we say? Of course, we take the position that radical feminists are fundamentally right on this issue, that pornography is inherently objectifying, and that the concept of feminist pornography, which is argued for by many liberal feminists, that's an oxymoron, right? Pornography by its very nature is objectifying. So, the idea that there is a form of it which is respectful or which is not damaging to the concept of equality, that's impossible, right? And most importantly, because this idea has been debated within the movement in the history of the Midnight Cry, the concept of agency, right? We take the position that women's agency cannot be used as an argument to sanitize sexist practices, right? Because the liberal feminists say that the woman chose it and it's empowering by the simple virtue of her having chosen it. And radical feminists say, no, it's not enough to simply say that women chose it, but what is the context of that decision, right? What is the context of that decision? What are the conditions under which those decisions are being made? What is the social conditioning which is leading some of these women to make these choices, right? And when you start to investigate that, you look at the context, you start to see that in a society that objectifies women and views their value primarily, and views their value and primary contribution as relating to their bodies, right? Within this context, choices to engage in pornography, in prostitution, or degrading sexual practices, these cannot be seen as freedom in the truest sense, right? That's what radical feminists say. And in this movement, when presented with any question, as far as our methodology is concerned, what is the first thing that we must do with the subject that we're considering? We cannot look at it in a vacuum. We must contextualize it. So even our own thinking in line of methodology, how we would approach this subject, agrees with that of the with the position that the radical feminists are presenting. So the feminist movement was deeply divided. Oh, did someone say something?
Sorry, Tipo, would you just clarify, please, quickly? Anti-porn and sex positive. Which one is liberal? Which one is radical, you're saying?
Okay. The radical feminists were, they were what I refer to as anti-porn feminists who rejected porn. Many of them even advocated for pornography to be made illegal, right, to be banned, right, because they saw all these harmful effects that it had on women, and that it was sexist, right? So those were the anti-porn feminists, and they were made up mostly of radical feminists. Then you have the sex positive feminists who emphasized the woman's agency in the matter, that women were able to choose. They emphasize, well, they're coming in from this idea of pushing against the idea that sex is something that men want and that women endure, right? That women enjoy the practice and have agency to choose, right? What they want to do, what they want to engage in, and so on and so forth. And by simple virtue of their having chosen what they want, the mere fact that a woman has chosen, that is empowerment, right? And the radical feminists are saying, no, look at the society in which the women are making these choices. What is leading them to make these choices, right? And when you look at the society, the societal context, the cultural conditioning, right, involved in this society, choices for women to engage in certain these practices, just the fact that a woman is chosen is not enough, right? These practices are still harmful. Does that help?
Excellently. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so the feminist movement was deeply divided by these debates. And many historians mark these debates as the marking the end of the second wave feminist era, right? It began in 1963, and you come to the end of the 80s when these debates are taking place. And the end of the second wave marks the beginning of the third wave of feminism. So now we come to the third wave. The third wave is most commonly understood as a push by younger generations to create a feminism that is more centered on inclusivity, right? Third wave feminism privileges the plights of queer non-white women in their messaging. And it is an amalgamation of many different streams of theorizing, including that of women of color and younger women disillusioned with what they perceive, disillusioned with essentially where second wave feminism left off. That didn't go far enough. So within the writing on third wave feminism, there is pretty much a consensus that it began in 1991, right? However, there are things that happened in 1989 that are worth mentioning that we discussed in the Sabbath school. You have the concept of intersectionality being introduced. And what is intersectionality? You have Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in 1989, and the story as she tells it was she's a lawyer, and she took a case where a construction company in New York, was seen presented a demonstrable pattern of not hiring Black women. So a group of women sued this company, and Crenshaw took the case. And the argument that persuaded the judge was essentially the fact that the company hired some Black men, and the fact that the company hired some white women, that those two facts meant that a case could not be made that these Black women were being discriminated against, notwithstanding what could be seen as a pretty clear pattern, right? That was the argument that won the day, and Crenshaw lost that case. So she framed, so you have these women, right? Black men are oppressed on their account of being Black, and women, the white women, may be oppressed on account of being women, but you have the Black women who fell in the intersection between these two issues of both being Black and being women, and how these issues layered up to oppress them in different ways, right? That is the concept of intersectionality that she expressed. So it's the idea that people experience layers of oppression caused by different things: gender, race, class, right? So intersectionality is important because it becomes an important concept in both feminist theory, but as well as the social sciences more broadly, sociology, right? So you have that 1989. You have the court case, Price Waterhouse versus Hopkins, where Ann Hopkins was passed over for promotion to partner 2 years in a row. And she was told that it was because of her lack of conformity to stereotypes about women, about how women should act. Right? She was described as aggressive, foul-mouthed, demanding, but some of those things, when a man is assertive, a woman doing the same thing is viewed as aggressive, right? When a man is principled or stands his ground, right? When a woman does the same thing, she becomes demanding, right? So a lot of issues of perception that are involved in sexism, right? So she was described as aggressive, demanding, impatient, and so on and so forth. And she was told that in order to increase her chances of promotion, she needed to walk more femininely, talk more femininely, dress more femininely. And she was well qualified for partnership and frequently outperformed her male co-workers. But nevertheless, she was looked over twice. And after that, after being looked over for partner 2 years in a row, she filed a lawsuit that she won under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which I mentioned earlier, right? So the Supreme Court ruled in Hopkins' favor, establishing the fact that gender stereotyping is illegal and it is actionable as sex discrimination, which is illegal, right? So you have that in 1989. But in 1991, where a lot of academics mark the beginning of the third wave, you have the nomination of Clarence Thomas and the controversy over his abuse of Anita Hill, right? You have, Daniela did very well. Clarence Thomas was nominated to the Supreme Court. Anita Hill emerges with revelations of his sexual abuse against her. Notwithstanding all that testimony, his nomination was successful, right? And he became a Supreme Court judge. Now that generated a reaction within women's rights movements and the feminist movement, right? Where a feminist scholar like Rebecca Walker, she coined the term third wave feminism, right? And speaking about Clarence Thomas's nomination, she was saying, I have a quote here, I'll read it for you. He says, "So I write this as a plea to all women, especially women of my generation. Let Thomas's confirmation serve to remind you, as it did me, that the fight is far from over. Let this dismissal of a woman's experience move you to anger. Turn that outrage into political power. Do not vote for them unless they work for us. Do not have sex with them. Do not break bread with them. Do not nurture them if they don't prioritize our freedom to control our bodies and our lives. I am not a post-feminism feminist. I am the third wave." Right. So it's from that article that she wrote in Miss Magazine, an article called "Becoming the Third Wave." This was in 1992 that she wrote that. That's where the term third wave feminism comes from. This wave of feminist activity that is seen as being triggered by the nomination of Clarence Thomas. So Walker, she established the fact that feminism is not over. There's still work to do, and Thomas's nomination is evidence of the fact that there is still work to do, right? Third wave feminism saw the emergence of new feminist currents and theories, such as ecofeminism, transfeminism, postmodern feminism, right? All these various schools, which is why it's very hard to define the feminist movement, why it's also hard sometimes to nail down distinctly the waves that are discussed, is because there's so much there is there's so much confusion, right? There's so much fragmentation, right? And some writers say this characteristic of being fragmented, it is in itself a characteristic of third wave feminism, right? So arguably the biggest challenge to third wave feminism was ideas within society, right? The idea that the fact that the gains of the second wave began to be taken for granted, the importance of feminism was no longer understood by and large, right? The presence of feminism in people's lives, it was like something, it was like oxygen in the air or fluoride in the water. It just is. It's not something that people gave significant thought to. So essentially the claim was that gender equality had been achieved, right? The first two waves had achieved gender equality. And with this idea becoming prevalent, attempts to push further for women's rights began to be seen as irrelevant or even unnecessary, or even pushing the pendulum too far in women's favor, right? And you start to see heated debates about whether affirmative action was really creating gender equality or whether it was punishing white middle-class men simply for being men, right? You see some of these arguments transferring to the issue of race as well. When affirmative action is brought up in the area of race, notwithstanding the historic context, notwithstanding the current context of inequality, they still say that, well, no, this is just punishing people for being born the way they are and giving unfair advantages to others. So this attitude was one of the biggest challenges confronting third wave feminism to this day. And so third wave feminism focuses heavily on consciousness raising, right? Education around the issues, opening people's minds to the fact that male domination still exists and that it still does affect women. And these are the various ways in which it continues to affect women today. So that's an overview of third wave feminism. Now, with fourth wave feminism, there is talk within some circles of a fourth feminist wave. And those who do talk about it mark it as beginning in 2012 or around 2012. However, there are so many fractures within the feminist movement at present. And there's so much debate that there isn't any real agreement on it, which is also why I find Alda Tess did not talk about a fourth wave, even, to keep it simple. She just focused on the three because it really becomes much more murky after that. So it's best to keep it simple. Something can be simple and still be correct, right? So I'll not be talking about that. We're just doing an overview. So third wave feminism brings us to the present. Early on, we had spoken about three main branches that emerged during the second wave. Okay, so I have some bullets sort of framing the context for this part that we're about to go into, but for time, I'll just skip ahead. So liberal and radical feminism emerged in the second wave. We spoke about that in relation to the feminist sex wars. You have cultural feminism, which emerged in 1975 as a rejection of the radical feminist perspective. Right, so cultural feminism emerged in 1975, and it emerged as a reaction to the radical feminist perspective, which had sought to turn away from gender essentialism. Right. So what's gender essentialism. Gender essentialism is essentially defining people by their gender, that they are qualities inherent to specific genders, and therefore they're qualities inherent to specific individuals, depending on the gender that they are. Now, radical feminists sought to move away from this to promote a perspective which considered the individuality of the person. Right? So radical feminists, they believe that there is a female nature or a female essence, and this can be characterized by, women are more relational, more subjective, more nurturing, more mothering, more caring, right? You know those stereotypical associations. And they subscribe to this concept that there's a female essence, and their work is to change society, change how society values these attributes, right? Historically, these attributes have been looked down upon, undervalued. Their belief is that, yes, there is an essential female nature, but what we need to change is how society, we need to revalue these attributes, right?
Verification, Kabul.
Yes.
Was that cultural?
Yes, that's cultural.
Because you said radical, but it is cultural, right?
Sorry, cultural. I was about to do it again.
No,
cultural. Okay. So cultural feminism actually even goes further sometimes to identify these female characteristics as actually being superior to that of male characteristics, right? So what is the problem with cultural feminism? Well, the problem is firstly that it's not true, right? It begins with a wrong premise. It starts from a faulty foundation. And that wrong premise is that there is an essential female nature, right? And so by adopting the idea that there are certain traits inherent to all women, what does that do? It narrows or boxes in the women that do not fit into those characteristics. And that narrowing, that boxing in is in and of itself a form of oppression. If taken to its logical conclusion, you can expect cultural feminism to lead to other inequalities and oppressions, the same inequalities and oppressions as patriarchy, really, if not reversed, when it presents the idea that these female traits are superior to those of male traits, right? So one has to be careful. One has to be careful, right? Where cultural feminism forms a trap sometimes is in how they interpret information. We have to be careful how we interpret information, right? Because if you look at UNICEF statistics, UN statistics, if you look at, there's all this data out there on the benefits of women in the workplace, the better results achieved when women are involved in peacekeeping efforts in conflicts, right? So you see the result, and we're looking at the same result, but they will attribute it to the female essence, the female nature, right, at work, that women are inherently better at these things. When these outcomes have more to do with the fact that women are not carrying around, at least not to the same degree, the competitive and combative qualities encouraged by toxic masculinity, for example, right? So we need to be careful how we interpret information. And I think that may be where people may risk falling into the gender essentialist trap, because they present this information and the information is correct, but how they interpret it becomes the issue. Liberal feminism. Yes?
Sorry, if I could just comment, that's where jokes and some of these kind of lines that get bandied about in society. Oh, just send a woman to do the job, or oh, you better get a female on your board, or whatever, are contributing to the disinformation being propagated.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I agree with that. So, yes. So you have cultural feminism. That's not the way we want to go. Then you have liberal feminism. Liberal feminism is also referred to as mainstream feminism, and it is a main branch of feminism, defined by its focus on achieving gender equality through political and legal reform within the framework of a liberal democracy, right? So liberal feminism, it works within the structure of mainstream society and seeks to integrate women within that structure. And its emphasis is on the public world, especially laws and political institutions, right? Liberal feminists, they separate out the legal world from the choices women make in their private lives regarding marriage, dress, lifestyle, family planning. They see no contradiction in embracing the things radical feminists identify as symbols of oppression, right? Such as makeup, shapewear, women's magazines, provocative or sexualized fashion, right? Or even playing into society's preoccupation with women's bodies and sexuality and so on. They see no contradiction between arguing for women's equality on a legal and political level, while maybe even adopting these practices in their personal lives, right? And again, the concept is that as long as a woman chooses, that is an empowerment in and of itself. But the problem with this is that liberal feminists, they fall into the same trap as cultural feminists, right? So you can argue for legal feminism, you can argue for feminism at the legal level, but by leaving the sexism in your personal life, by leaving the sexism in personal lives, you're still operating on an unequal foundation, right? So cultural feminism will not bring equality. Liberal feminism will not bring equality, right? So the liberal feminist model essentially amounts to surface work and fails to penetrate deep enough to actually address the problem of sexism, right? Okay, so in my notes, I had made okay, we don't have a lot more to go through. I'd made a parallel between the issue of liberal feminism and the Biden Democrats, right? What's the issue with the Biden Democrats? Compromise, the desire to work within the framework of the system rather than observe that the entire system is problematic. The entire system is unequal and needs reform, right? And I'll speak more about this, but it's not enough to change laws, right? It's not enough to deal with issues at an institutional level, because we'll see that injustice, inequality can prevail in spite of the law, in spite of institutional regulation. As long as people's mindsets are not changed, you will continue to see the inequality being perpetuated. Then we come to radical feminism. Radical feminism is a perspective within feminism that arose within the second wave, yes, and it calls for a radical reordering of society in which male supremacy is eliminated in all social and economic contexts, while recognizing that women's experiences are also affected by other social divisions such as race, class, sexual orientation, etc. So radical feminists view society as fundamentally a patriarchy in which men dominate and oppress women. That's the fundamental paradigm through which they view the world. And they seek to abolish the patriarchy as part of their struggle to liberate everyone from an unjust society. They seek to change societal norms. They seek to change social norms and not just to reform institutions. So I have some points about some of the theory of radical feminism, but I'll just go on to say that their goal, unlike that of the first feminist movement, is not just to the elimination of male privilege, right, in a legal or political sense, but they seek to do away with the sex distinction itself, right? They seek to create a world in which genital differences between human beings will no longer matter culturally. For me, that has parallels, as I understand it, rather. Parallels can be drawn with that and the civil rights movement. What did Martin Luther King argue for? He says, in his I Have a Dream speech, he says, I have a dream that people will be judged rather not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Martin Luther King sought to strove for a society in which race would not matter culturally, right? That's how I understand it. And what is being sought by radical feminists is a society in which people are judged rather by the content of their character, not by their genders. Right? So, but while they do want to see a society in which gender no longer matter, where sex distinction no longer matters culturally, they also maintain that certain things that are particular to women, such as their role in reproduction, that they should be recognized and accommodated without penalty in the workplace and so on. Right? So those are some an overview of radical feminism. Radical feminists gave voice to a slogan and a concept that would become mainstream. And this is the idea that the personal is political, or the private is political, right? And what this essentially means, it underscores the connection between personal experience and larger social and political structures, right? The idea that women being unhappy in their roles as housewives and mothers in homes, at the time during the second wave, it was seen to be a private issue. But what these feminists were saying in framing the concept that the personal is political is that women's personal issues, sex, childcare, the idea of women not being content with their lives at home, that these are political issues. And that they need political intervention to generate change, right? Okay, so radical feminists adopt this concept within the second wave, but it becomes a concept accepted more broadly within the feminist movement. So when we look at the message, we see that as we look at how the Midnight Cry has developed, we see it has become more nuanced as it has developed. At the beginning, there were two streams of information, right? Of course, CNN or Fox News or Democrats and Republicans, liberal and conservative. There were two streams, but then it became nuanced and we began to focus in on that correct stream. And we saw within that correct stream that it was not enough to just say, I'm in the correct stream of the two. Within the correct stream, there are things to consider. You have Biden Democrats, right? And Biden Democrats, they have a problem, right? What is the problem of the Biden Democrats? It's modeled for us in the external history of the Alpha of modern Israel. In that history, you see, compromise was the issue, right? The South compromising, the North compromising with the South. And that was the issue with the people who are supposedly on the right side. Then we come, and that forms a model for the external history now in the Omega of modern Israel. And we see that same compromise in the Biden Democrats. And that is of concern to us, not only externally, but we're to compare and contrast the external and the internal. That internally, our danger, if the danger externally is compromised, internally, we should see that compromise is an issue as well. And of course, this has been dealt with by Elder Tess, right? So, and then you come to the subject of feminism, that, you know, feminism is correct, that, you know, the message, the working out of the development of the message places us in agreement with feminism, broadly speaking. But we see that even within feminism, it's not enough to just be feminist. It becomes even more nuanced, right? So there are these three camps: cultural, liberal, and radical. And radical feminists, as we understand it, present the right perspective. They present the right perspective on the scope of the problem of sexism, that it's a trans-historical phenomena, right? The oldest and foundational form of oppression, right? And they present the right understanding that it requires a radical reordering of society. It is not something that, you know, in contrast to liberal feminism, for example. It cannot be achieved by simply passing laws, as we have many examples of how prejudice can persist, notwithstanding the presence of laws against it, right? A change in mindset is needed. Radical feminists have the right perspective on pornography and the sex industry, and on degrading or sexual practices that promote inequality, I guess, whatever the context, right? That the sex industry is inherently exploitative of women, and efforts to rehabilitate these industries as positive or empowering are misguided. Radical feminists are right in their perspective about the beauty industry. Liberal feminists tend to accept and conform to these standards, to these beauty standards. Radical feminists reject them as placing undue burdens on women, right? It places undue financial burdens on women that men don't face, undue psychological burdens, right? With regards to the impacts on self-image and self-esteem on women who are not able to conform to these standards. Radical feminists are also right on fashion and the sexualizing nature of many of the current fashions, right? Liberal feminists, on the other hand, tend to argue that women should be free to dress, do, you know, whatever the case, right? Radical feminists would say, yes, you have the freedom to choose, but what is behind that choice? Which which is the question our methodology would lead us to ask. What is behind that choice? What is the context? Social, cultural, and historic context within which that choice is being made, right? So when that is considered, irrespective of your choices and motivations, certain decisions become sexist. They perpetuate inequality regardless of the motivations of the individual making them. Right. So we are in agreement as well with the radical feminist perspective of the personal being political. Right. Sorry, our friend Renko here is making a bit of noise. Okay, so in closing, radical feminism, as far as the development of the message, we find that radical feminism is the perspective that agrees with the message. But even within radical feminism, the path becomes even narrower, because you have radical feminists that are not accepting of transgender people in the trans community, right? They feel that trans women are taking up space and taking attention away from women's rights. And we're not in agreement with that. You know, we believe that trans women are women and that they should be given equal space, right, with cisgender men and women, as far as the consideration of the subject of gender equality is concerned. Right. So I think I've spoken at length. My purpose was to give an overview of the history of feminism, an overview of the main schools of feminism, and identify, what is the correct position to be taking on this important subject, given that the test in this dispensation, or the test for the world really going forward, centers on the subject of gender. So I will close with a word of prayer, and then we'll stop our recording. Let's pray. Lord in heaven, we thank you for the ground that we've been able to cover. Please guide us all as we reflect on these things, as we reflect on our thinking, our own behavior, our own perspectives on this testing subject. Help us not only for our own salvation, but because we must be sound witnesses to people, the people groping in darkness right now, who are seeking salvation. Please bless us throughout the remainder of the Sabbath, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.